So in the past videos we've gone through all of the particulars. Let's look at some real specific examples of security scenarios, going from the most liberal with the least amount of security to the one with a more typical kind of a lockdown situation. Let's look at scenario 1. This would be a completely open security in which we're granting read access to all tags on the Pi server for all users. We would like all users to be able to define data sources, and we want all users to be able to create data sets and the different configurations, the table behaviors. So how would we do something like that? You'll find the solution to this in the notes section of your PowerPoint slides. So if we look at the notes section, you'll see the solution here is that you would set up your application pool identity so that it's not using the configured user, it's using network service. Again, let me show you how to do that. Now I'll switch over to look at the WebParts page. This is the machine that's hosting RT WebParts on an IIS server. And under Application Pools, under this computer, I'm going to look for the SharePoint application pool. And under Properties, what we're talking about here is if you've set this up so the application pool is predefined, not configurable to a specific user, then if that's how you've chosen to do it, then you would simply create on the Pi server, you would create a trust that's based on the machine name, and that trust would be associated with the powerful Pi admin user. Now again, let me remind you how to add those domain users to these two Windows groups. I would go into the administrative tools on the server and choose the Active Directory users. So I'll go into Programs, let's go into Administrative Tools, Active Directory users and computers, and you'll find these two Windows groups here. You would simply make all domain users members of these two Windows groups. So that would be the first, the most, or the least restrictive of the scenarios in which everybody basically has permission to do just about anything within RT WebParts. In the second scenario, we've made one change. Instead of allowing all users the ability to define data sources in these table configurations and trend configurations, instead of that, we're allowing just specific users. Now, granting access to be able to create data sources is controlled by two things. First of all, these users have to be, their Windows usernames have to be configured in those two Windows security groups, the RT Baseline Admin and RT WebParts Admin. And then secondly, when these data sources are created and configurations are created, we need to store that information in the module database. So the Pi user that these Windows users are mapped to, that Pi user needs the permission to write to the module database. It's kind of tricky because when we say user, we're talking about two different things here. Sometimes Windows user, sometimes Pi user. So I'll try to keep those straight as we look at the solution. The solution here is we would configure the application pool identity to be predefined, and therefore it's going to use the network service. Okay. That's what we did before. Now this time, these two Windows groups, RT Baseline Admin, RT WebParts Admin, those Windows groups are not going to contain entries for all domain users, just in this case for specific domain users. So specific domain users will be granted membership in those two Windows security groups. Now remember, those are Windows users we're talking about here. Now, over on the Pi server, you would create a trust. That trust is going to be based on machine, just as we did before, but instead of mapping that trust to Pi admin, since the application pool identity only really needs read access, we only need to map that to Pi demo, not Pi admin. So that's going to be the trust that takes care of the access to the application pool identity. Now we also need to create trusts to give those specific Pi users write access to the module database so that we can store those data sources. Now when we use the word user, in this case we're talking about a Pi user. So if you remember how the connection works, when the client tries to connect to the Pi server, RT WebParts passes along, it's actually the Pi SDK passes along those Windows usernames and passwords to the Pi server. The Pi server maps that window user and password to a Pi user and password through the trust table. It's that Pi user that needs read-write access. So whatever Pi user these incoming connections get mapped to, that Pi user or users needs read-write access to the module database so that we can save or store the configurations for the data sources, etc. Now you'll notice the potential for kind of an ambiguous situation here with regard to trusts, because we've got, if you do have an incoming connection, we'll have, or may be able to map to two different trusts or match the credentials for two different trusts. If we've got a trust that's based on machine name, and we've also got a trust that's based on the Windows user and password, well, any kind of an incoming connection that's coming from that machine is going to match the machine name, and plus it may or may not match the Windows user credentials. The reason that we shouldn't worry about this is because if we make this the trusts here more specific, have higher requirements, map to individual users, for example, then that's going to get basically it's going to supersede the less restrictive trust defined by the machine name. Now there's a whole scoring system. We're not going to get into it in this class, but there's a whole scoring system to how the trusts work. And basically when you're mapping to a specific user, that's going to give you a very high score. So that's why in the case that you have trusts coming, or trusts that, or connections that match multiple trusts, we're going to go with whichever gets the highest score, which in this case is going to give us access based on the username, which is the more privileged access that we need in this case. In this last scenario, we're going to change the access to the tags such that only certain users have access to certain tags. That can be done on a user-by-user and tag-by-tag basis. Now this is something that is going to require that you modify the tag definitions so that you can create, for example, tags that are only available to members of certain groups, that are only read access available to members of certain groups. So in addition to setting this security up that I'm about to describe, you also have to go in and make sure your tags have been set up such that, just like in traditional Pi security, you can set up so certain users or certain groups of users can see those tags and others can't. So in order to implement this, I would first of all make sure that the application pool is set to configurable. It's set to a specific domain user instead of predefined as we've done it before. So let me show you what that looks like. Again, in the SharePoint, or in the IIS Manager, under the application pool section under SharePoint, we see identity can be either predefined or configurable. We're going to set this as configurable to a specific Windows user. Next, any users, these are Windows users who are going to require the ability to build those data sets, you're going to give them access to the RT Baseline Admin and RT WebParts admin groups. And again, now that is done, again, on the server. That's done using the Active Directory Manager. Just looking at these two groups here, you would add those Windows users. Now that much is what we would do on the SharePoint server side. On the Pi server side, here are the changes we're going to have to make. First of all, we don't want to create any trust based on machine. We're going to do without the trust-based, or the machine-based trust in this case. Okay. Now the application pool is going to require access, so we're going to set up a trust for that application pool user and give that whatever Pi user that incoming Windows user that we just defined maps to, we're going to give that Pi user read access. So again, the Windows user that we associated with this, we create a trust that maps that Windows user to a Pi user who has read access to all tags. In addition, we need, as we've done before, we need to give specific read-write access to the users who were put into this RT Baseline Admin, RT WebParts admin group. Those are the users who need to create data sources and configurations. So those users are going to need write access. Now in the first scenario, we didn't have to do any of that because we had a machine trust that was giving everybody access, write access to that. But in this case, we do need to, as we did in the second scenario, we need to identify those people specifically. Finally, there's the issue of how do we actually map individual users to be able to read or not read individual tags. Well, I'd like to explain it like this. Do you remember our discussion of how the initial connection works? The initial connection from RT WebParts user, this is a user who's logged in as a Windows username Chuck, that user connects to RT WebParts to SharePoint, and it's actually the application pool identity that is going to, through the SDK, is going to initiate a connection to the Pi server. Now that Pi server receives the Windows credentials and maps those to the trust table to hopefully resolve to a Pi user that is associated with that Windows user. Well, that Pi user needs read access to the tags in question. See, on that first request, we use the Windows login account to authenticate, and then from that point forward, you get whatever privileges that user you've mapped to are. So in this case, it would be Pi admin. That's no problem. Pi admin has access to everything. But in the scenario we're describing here, you would want to map this incoming Pi user, or this incoming Windows user, to a Pi user who has read access just to those specific tags that you're interested in. Now, just a footnote here, the reason why we needed to create that first trust for the application pool identity is because all the subsequent requests for credentials, or excuse me, all of the subsequent requests for data use the credentials of the application pool. So that application pool needs read access to all the tags. But remember, that application pool is more or less, it's impersonating the Pi user that we mapped to in the initial call. So returning here to our solution, you can see that the last set of trusts, one or more trusts, is a trust that will map the incoming Windows user to a user who has read access to the tags in question.